Characters of the Reformation, Part 9. Oliver Cromwell. We have seen in the case of Laud one of the effects of the 17th century struggle upon the Protestant side of that struggle. Laud was the type of leader of those English Protestants who tried to reconcile their departure from Catholic unity and some lurking sympathy with a memory of the Catholic past. In the same Protestant camp, there was present an opposite, growing force of a much more active kind, what was soon called Puritanism. Of this force, Oliver Cromwell is the representative type. It is accident, of course, that made him so. But for his emergence as a leader of genius during the English Civil Wars, was he not but any one of those more energetic contemporaries on the same side might appear to us today the type of militant Protestant? But though it is an accident which made of Oliver Cromwell a symbolic figure, it is worth while examining the nature and fortunes in that capacity. We have seen how the character of Protestantism, as it grew, took on substance and developed a particular spirit, summed up in the name of John Calvin. It is his main doctrines, his attitude towards the universe, which has given tone and color to the whole Protestant movement. And though men are affected by the Calvinistic spirit in many various degrees, from those who feel it vividly and profoundly to those who only feel it vaguely and superficially, wherever the Protestant type of mind exists, it is Calvin at work. We have also seen that the special marks of Calvin's doctrine were: he had accepted from earlier men the doctrine of salvation by faith alone, the idea that good works are of themselves no profit to salvation. But though he was not the first to maintain this, for that matter there have been many among the theologians who had, long before the Reformation, come perilously near to such an affirmation. It was he who affirmed it most firmly, and with the clearest definition, and he who made it triumph. Equal in importance is Calvin's second point, summed up in the word predestination. Not only does the Creator know who will be saved and who will be damned, not only must he have known it from all eternity, but also he must have willed it. Calvin admitted only one will in the universe, and by that will, not by man's own will, still less by man's own acts, was he saved or damned. The third essential in the Calvinist spirit is the doctrine of conversion. The individual knows by a personal revelation, vouchsafed to him privately at a particular moment, that he is one of God's elect, predestined to glory and beatitude, while around them are the great mass of those whom God has condemned to eternal misery. To all this add Calvin's doctrine of church government. Calvin, being a Frenchman, and therefore alive with the power and desire to organize a complete system, determined to erect against the universal Catholic Church a new church, which would be the guardian of these new truths, whereas he was the prophet. The Church of Calvin's we know now today as the Presbyterian organization. It is important to remember that those who came under the influence of the Calvinist spirit, only a certain proportion, indeed a minority, adhered to its full scheme. Many, including Cromwell himself, were sharply opposed to the idea of a strictly disciplined religious organization for the protection and propagation of a new religion. They argued that since private judgment was the essence of Protestantism, each congregation must be left free to believe and affirm what it chose. But the fact that there was this internal quarrel between the complete Calvinist Protestant and the more general Calvinist spirit of those who would not accept the organization of the Calvinist Church must not blind us to the essential Calvinism of the whole characteristically Protestant movement. Cromwell himself was an excellent example of this. He actually disliked the idea of a strict Presbyterian church. He fought it not only with arguments, but with armies. His own particular group called themselves Independents in order to emphasize their attitude. They would have nothing to do with what the Scotch call the Kirk. They proved this when it was attempted to impose Presbyterianism on England after the Scotch alliance, which the English Revolutionary Party had formed in order to fight the king. Yet, although he thus opposed the Kirk, no one was more thoroughgoing in his Calvinist philosophy than Cromwell. No one went through a more violent personal conversion. No one was more eager to assert the indefectibility of the saints, that is, the Calvinist doctrine that those who had once felt conversion were ever after secure of salvation and could not lose grace. No one was more permeated with that spirit of prostration before the omnipotence and majesty of God than was Cromwell. No one was filled with a more violent zeal against the reprobate. No one in action was more ruthless against the enemies of the new religion. The way in which Cromwell was typical of the whole Calvinist business is nowhere better seen than in his attitude towards the old religion, which this new religion had set out to kill. That is, his attitude towards Catholicism. Catholicism was for him the very spirit of evil, to destroy which, from off the face of the earth, seemed to him the highest of the duties lying to his hand in so far as he could fulfill it. He could fulfill it to a considerable degree in this one province of Europe, the British Isles, when he had achieved despotic power. And his intense fanaticism on his point appears especially in his treatment of Ireland. For the rest and in general, Cromwell was the typical figure of what is called Puritanism. Puritanism is a particular form and degree of Protestantism which has especially flourished in England, Scotland, and Wales, but of which there were wide eras throughout the Protestant world, notably in Scandinavia and Holland. To be a Puritan is almost exactly the same as to be what the Old World used to call a Manichaean. The Puritan and the Manichae have the same attitude towards the universe. Their creeds work out to the same moral and social practice. There is one doctrinal difference between them. For while the Manichae believes in an evil principle which works side by side with and is equal to the principle of good in the universe, the Puritan, proceeding from Calvin and therefore only admitting one will in the universe, makes both evil and good combine in the same awful God who permits, and in a sense wills, evil, and particularly the sufferings of man. There is then this difference in doctrine between the two. The old heresy which continually reappears throughout the earlier Christian centuries, and the new heresy of the 16th century. But in practice the effects of the two were just the same, and Puritanism made of the society which it affected very much what the Albigenses made of their society in the 12th and 13th centuries, and the Bulgarian heretics made of theirs in an earlier time still. The sentiment, rather than the conviction, that the material world is evil, and therefore all that sensual joy is in essence evil, lies at the root of Puritanism. Joy in the arts, delight in beauty, and the rest of it, are the Puritan's object of hatred. He sees them all as rivals to the majesty of God and obstacles which deflect the pure worship of that majesty. It has been remarked by a curious byproduct of Puritanism that it threw men back on to the pursuit of wealth as their main occupation. It is from Puritanism that we derive modern industrial capitalism, the centralization of wealth in a few hands, the dispossession of the masses, and their exploitation by a small number of those who control the means of production, all that we call capitalism. But though industrial capitalism and its evils are a product of Puritanism, they are only so at second hand. The Puritan of Oliver Cromwell's day, and Oliver Cromwell himself, the typical Puritan, was greedy of wealth indeed, but not as a single occupation of the mind, nor even as the chief business of man. The ardent occupation of Cromwell, and those like him, was the contemplation and worship of Calvin's sanguinary God, the defense of his proclaimed worship, and the extirpation of his enemies. The accidents by which Oliver Cromwell became the typical figure of English Protestantism in its extreme or puritanical form were these. He was a cadet of one of those millionaire families who had gained their enormous wealth out of the wreck of the monasteries during the period of the Reformation. His father, of whom he was the only surviving son, was himself the only son of the enormously wealthy Sir Henry Cromwell. And Henry was the son of Richard Cromwell, nephew of Thomas Cromwell, the man who dissolved the monasteries under Henry VIII. Richard Cromwell's real name was Richard Williams. He was nephew to Thomas because his mother had been Thomas Cromwell's sister, his mother having married a tavern keeper in Putney, near London, whose name was Williams. Richard took on his important relative's name, but both he and those who succeeded him had to use the name Williams for legal purposes, and when his great-grandson, Oliver, lay in state, the title Oliver Cromwell, alias Williams, was embroidered on the half-royal hangings which draped the bed. When his father died, Oliver Williams, alias Cromwell, inherited an income of what we should call today something more than £3,000 a year. But though his fortune was moderate, compared with many of his rank, what marked him out was the immense fortune of those to whom he belonged. The Reformation has been called a rising of the rich against the poor. This does not apply to it in the remote valleys of Switzerland and the Scandinavian fells, but it is an epigram more than half true of its progress in England. And the fact that Oliver belonged to one of those millionaire families recently founded on the loot of religious endowments is highly characteristic of the whole time. The House of Commons, to which he was returned as a young man, was composed almost entirely of rich people like himself, great landowners and their relatives, with here and there a prominent lawyer, or, quite exceptionally, a prominent merchant. The English House of Commons was in those days a body, only called together as a rule for brief periods. It was always summoned on the accession of a monarch, and whenever there was important and solemn law-making to be done, it was summoned to confirm the king's will and to subscribe to what he and his council and the great lords had decided. The crown had become so poor in Cromwell's time that government could not be carried on without special voluntary grants by the owners of property, and for making these grants there was no one but the House of Commons. It took advantage of its position to attack the powers of the king, and the quarrel ultimately ended in a civil war. Of the Parliament, the Lords, for the most part, hesitated to rise in armed rebellion. Of their relatives and fellow landowners, the Commons, more than half, or about half, were prepared to levy a regular war against the king. But even those of the richer classes who were reluctant to attack the crown physically were nearly all at heart opposed to the old claims of the crown in government, and they nearly all wanted at heart to supplant government by a king whose duty and function it was to protect the poor against the rich, the weak against the strong. They desired to supplant him and take over the government themselves. That, in effect, is what they did. They won their war. They put the king to death, and among them was the amateur soldier who so rapidly became the best professional soldier of his time, Cromwell. He had a genius for forming and leading cavalry. No one suspected it, least of all himself, until the opportunity came which made it manifest. Cromwell was already in his 43rd year when the war broke out. He had barely entered his 45th when it was clear that he would become the principal military figure. He was installed the head of the victorious army by the time that he was 48, and in his 50th year it was he who plotted for and achieved the death of King Charles. He proceeded to the conquest of Ireland, a task which he accomplished with horrible cruelty, and as a result of which he dispossessed 19/20ths of the Irish nation, confiscating their land wholesale. He intended to destroy the Catholic Church altogether in that country. He thought that he had achieved that end before he died, but there he was mistaken. The Scottish Presbyterians had fought as allies of the parliamentary rebels during the Civil War, but the Scotch people had a strong feeling in favor of the Stuart dynasty, which was itself Scotch in origin. They sent an army to save the king after he had lost the war in England, which army Cromwell defeated in the most brilliant of his campaigns. They tried to make the dead king's son take the place of his father, and this gave Cromwell the opportunity for conquering Scotland, as he had conquered Ireland. He died the complete master through his military machine of the three kingdoms, and the possessor for the moment of the strongest military force in Europe. All that political experiment of an English military republic under a protector was ephemeral. It was bound to break down, and did so within 2 years of Cromwell's death. He died on the 3rd of September, 1658, and the dead king's son, young Charles, returned and was crowned Charles II in the spring of 1660. Nevertheless, that for which Cromwell stood had, in effect, conquered. Those who retained Catholic principles and inclinations in England were still very numerous. When he died, they were still more than a quarter of the population. In Ireland, in spite of massacre and wholesale robbery, the great Catholic mass stood firm, and there at least 7/8 of the people retained their religion in spite of the conquest. But the Civil War had completed, both in Britain and in Ireland, that long process of Catholic impoverishment and Protestant enrichment which had begun with the dissolution of the monasteries more than 100 years before, and had been continued with the Irish confiscations under Elizabeth, and completed with the enormous fines levied upon all those landowners in England who stood out boldly and openly proclaimed themselves Catholic. Further, the victory of those for whom Cromwell stood, and of whom he was the most conspicuous leader, was the virtual end of the monarchy. Although kingship had come back amid universal rejoicing, before young Charles had been crowned at Westminster, and all the rest of it, the great landowners and the great merchants, acting through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which they formed, took over the government in England and have retained it ever since. Further, after that episode there could be no question of the Catholic faith returning in any strength. It might have survived in a large fraction of the people, but it could never again mold the general spirit of England. Oliver Cromwell, therefore, is not only the chief Puritan figure at the decisive moment, the 17th century, when the Protestant and Catholic separated finally and agreed to call it a drawn battle. He is also the figure who marks the turning point in the transformation of England from a Catholic to a Protestant country. The process was not completed under him. Catholicism largely survived in England till it received its death blow there in 1688. But by that time, the Protestant character of England as a whole was firmly fixed. René Descartes. In the midst of these political figures, kings and statesmen and soldiers, whom we have been considering in connection with the great religious struggle of the 17th century, we must turn for a moment to two men who had no political power. They were neither soldiers nor statesmen, nor men of any hereditary position, but they influenced the mind of Europe so greatly that their indirect effect weighed more than the direct effect of others. These two men stood to each other in time as might a father to a son. Descartes, nearly the contemporary of Cromwell, was born in 1596 and died in 1650. Pascal was 27 years younger, but died only 12 years after Descartes in 1662. It is remarkable to note how both of them survived to see the settlement in the political and military fields of the great quarrel between the Reformation and the Catholic Church. On the political field, that quarrel was settled, as we have seen, in 1648-49. The Peace of Westphalia, as the two treaties ending the 30 Years' War are called, was very nearly contemporary with the execution of Charles I, the end of Richelieu's great work and all the rest of it. In other words, both Pascal and Descartes lived during and past the turning point, and the impress which each of them stamped upon European thought was given just before it was too late. That is, while the society of Christendom was still sufficiently warm from the struggle to take an imprint, but no longer in the boiling effervescence of the original conflict. Born a generation earlier, Descartes and Pascal might have been heresiarchs. Born a generation later, one might have been a mere 18th century skeptic, and the other a mere private devotee. As it was, Their lives and activities were expended at a moment when they would be of maximum effect. Challenging criticism without actual condemnation, and influencing the Catholic culture without, at first, any disruptive effect. These two men represent the effects upon the Catholic culture of two very great forces let loose by the Reformation, or at any rate let loose by the breakup of the old United Christian Order in Europe. The first was rationalism. The second may be called, I think with propriety, emotionalism. Both men remained orthodox throughout their lives. Each could claim that he was not only orthodox but strongly attached to the Catholic Church and all that the Catholic Church believes and teaches. Yet from them proceeded results which stretched throughout the Catholic culture and shook its stability, while at the same time spreading far outside the boundaries of the culture into the Protestant culture and affecting the whole of European thought. Of the two, it was Descartes who did the most. He was undoubtedly the greater man. Indeed, intellectually, one of the greatest men Europe has ever produced. But, negatively, Pascal was also of high effect, because his example and the power of his word fostered that non-rational dependence upon emotion, which is ultimately as disruptive of Catholic solidity as is rationalism. Descartes was the man who started all that mode of thought which at last, in the 19th century, became universal, and is only now beginning to be questioned. The mode of thought which we sum up under the term scientific, which refuses to accept an affirmation that cannot be clearly stated and as clearly apprehended by the receiver, and refuses also to accept any affirmation, however clearly stated or clearly apprehended, unless it is accompanied by absolute proof based on deduction or experience. From Descartes there followed, as will I think be universally admitted, that tendency in all philosophy called modern, which till lately grew more and more skeptical of mystery, less and less concerned with the unseen, and more occupied with matters susceptible of repeated experiment and physical appreciation. When a man talks of the doctrine of immortality, for instance, as a speculation, while calling the chemical constitution of water out of oxygen and hydrogen a fact, he is at the end of a process which was begun by Descartes. Not that Descartes would have put anything so crudely and falsely as that, but from him proceeds the habit of founding certitude upon either mathematical truth or physical experiment, or the two combined, and nothing else. For instance, in that matter of the immortality of the soul, the man who says he will not accept immortality of the soul because there is no proof of it, means that he requires either a mathematical deductive proof proceeding from the first principles, which nobody doubts or can doubt, or that he requires physical proof by experiment. Well, the man who says, "I have come to believe in the immortality of the soul since I attended a spiritualist séance," is just as much a product of the Cartesian effect upon the world as a man who will not believe in immortality because it has not been proved to him. The man who only begins to believe in immortality because he thinks he has heard the voice of a dead person, or he has some other communication with him susceptible of physical test, is, in the sense wherein we are using that word, strictly rationalist. At this point it is important to define our terms, for rationalist and rationalism are terms that may be used in many varying senses. We mean by the Cartesian rationalism that habit of subjecting all examination of reality, that is, all the search after truth, to a certain process which is called that of the reason, and the reason only. It is in reality far too narrow a definition of the word reason, but it is that which the great bulk of men still give and still act upon. It is reasonable to accept the evidence of your senses. It is reasonable to accept a mathematical proof. But, they say, it is not reasonable to accept any truth on any other basis. In contrast to this profound effect of Descartes, we mark the effect of Pascal under what has been termed emotionalism. There is nothing out of the way tending to unorthodoxy, inimical of the Catholic solidity, in reliance upon emotion. Where Pascal's influence may be called destructive, or at any rate weakening to the strength of the Catholic culture, is in the tendency to substitute emotion for reason, to take emotion out of its proper sphere and give it authority in places where it has none. Thus we may say that Pascal, without in the least intending it, stood at the beginning of that recent movement called modernism, and there has been an influence flowing from Pascal, an influence which he himself would have bitterly regretted had he seen its fruits, tending to ignore definition in morals and doctrine because the definition is not an emotional process. There has also come from the same source a parallel tendency to deny any doctrine which shocks some emotion, or again, to affirm as certain something which the Church has not defined, but which suits the private emotion of the believer. When we use the term emotionalism in this particular sense, just as when we use the word rationalism in its particular sense, we mean allowing emotionalism in the one case, as reason in the other, to do something it was not intended to do, to step outside its proper sphere. Here is an example of emotionalism at war with reason. A modernist suffering from the ambient agnostic atmosphere of his time denies what he calls the historical resurrection of our Lord, yet he insists on the spiritual value, or spiritual truth, as we will even call it, of the resurrection. He ends by the absurdity that there are two truths. One, the truth that a thing actually happened, and the other, the truth that whether it happened or not does not count so long as it creates a pleasing emotion, to which he falsely attaches the word truth. Perhaps the most famous sentence of all that Pascal wrote is also the shortest example of this kind of thing. That sentence runs as follows: "The heart has its reasons of which the head knows nothing." This is perilously near to saying that emotion is certain of things which reason contradicts. Both men were great mathematicians, Descartes much the greater. Both men were remarkable writers, Pascal much the greater. From Pascal, you may say, comes the whole habit of a clear modern prose writing, and from Descartes comes the whole business of analytical geometry and the theory of the calculi, differential and integral. The process whereby each of these men attained the position he did was very different in either case. Descartes approached the problem of the discovery of truth by a process of elimination. What are we? Whence do we come? Whither do we go? What is the universe and what we are therein? To answer these prime questions, he began by throwing overboard everything which he felt he could not, in the new scientific temper of the time, affirm. And he reached the residuum that the only thing of which he was absolutely certain, the only thing which he could take as a first postulate, the only thing known, whence he could proceed to discover the unknown, was his own existence. That postulate was undoubtedly true, but it was the postulate of a skeptic, and it has acted ever since as a poison. For there is another thing of which we are also just as certain, really, as we are of our own existence, and that is the existence of things outside themselves. There is no rational process by which the reality of the external universe can be discovered. All we know is that it can be confidently affirmed. Aristotle, who might be called reason itself, St. Thomas, whose whole process was that of beginning with a doubt, and examining all there was to be said for that doubt, before the denial of it and the corresponding certitude could be arrived at, both postulate this second truth. Not only am I, but that which is not myself is just as real as I am, and what is more, can be and is apprehended by myself. That is, like all true philosophy, common sense. Your plain man, who is made in the image of God, and who, so long as his reason and conscience are not warped, is on the right lines, has no patience with any denial of it. The whole of human society takes it for granted, and must take it for granted. The witness of a court of justice, the man conducting his own affairs, the simplest activities of daily life, takes for granted and absolutely certain, though not the external universe in which we live, but our own power of apprehending it. Descartes returned to the very extreme of the old Greek skepticism, and said, no, we must begin with the prime certitude of our own existence, and from which, no doubt, we can proceed to a second certitude that the external world exists. But we must not take it as a primal postulate. Therefore it is from Descartes that the whole stream of modern skepticism flows. He built up a system carefully and accurately from so exiguous a beginning. It was like building a pyramid upside down, balanced upon a point. Yet that system was stable, and indeed, in all its main lines it has stood for 300 years. It included the idea which most men still have of space, of the universe in 3 dimensions and 3 dimensions only, of the value of physical experiment and the certitude of our scientific conclusions therefrom, of the certitude also of our power of measurement, upon which all modern physical science is built. The philosophy of Descartes remained stable and held the field because it was supported and continued by the rising flood of physical science. In some of his detailed conclusions he was fantastic, and would seem particularly fantastic in modern eyes. But his general spirit conquered the European mind and directed it right on into the memory of men now living. Indeed, no small part of our bewilderment, when we hear the doubts or questions of the latest physical science, is due to our being disturbed in what we ought to be our quite secure Cartesian philosophy, namely, that matter and spirit are quite distinct, and all that time and motion are referable to fixed standards, and so forth. But there is no denying Descartes' far-reaching influence. Blaise Pascal. Pascal started from the other end, from Descartes, of the mental process, not from a search for the last ultimate thing of which reason is certain, but from that which emotion most poignantly affirms. With Descartes it was, I am sure of one thing, that I think. With Pascal it was, I am sure of one thing, that I feel. Descartes began like a man pursuing a piece of research in history or chemistry. Pascal began like a man moved suddenly by a vision or a great love. The one would have told you that he had done nothing until he had begun to analyze, and the other that he had not lived until he had been overwhelmed by a spiritual flood from within. There were two occasions in Pascal's life in which he suffered or enjoyed that experience which is often called conversion. Each was confirming the other. Without either he would not have been what he was, and it was under the influence of intense personal feeling in the matter of religion that he began his famous quarrel with the Jesuits, which quarrel is, I am afraid, the main source of his reputation in the anti-Catholic world. For the attitude of the anti-Catholic world towards Pascal, and particularly the academic Protestant world, is something like this. The Jesuits are the quintessence of Catholicism. Pascal attacked the Jesuits. Therefore, although we are very sorry that he remained orthodox and was never excommunicated, we feel that he was on our side. Indeed, within Pascal's own lifetime there were a great many people not at all on the Jesuit side, nor speaking in favor of the Jesuits, who accused Pascal of bringing the Protestant tone of mind and even the Calvinist tone of mind by a back door into the Catholic Church. They were later to say the same thing of Fenelon. The root cause of the violent conflict between those of whom Pascal was the spokesman and the Jesuits was the fact that the Jesuits had made it their business to reconquer Europe for the Church. They had made the relief and reinforcement of the Church, that is, the collective thing whereby the individual lives, their objective, to use a military term for an effort that was essentially military in tone, être catholique, c'est tout. It was said to me once by a very holy Polish priest on his deathbed in Rome. He had never been a Jesuit or had much to do with them. But that is the core of the Jesuit matter. To be Catholic is all. Now, for Pascal and those who thought with Pascal, and of whom he was the voice and the pen, though not the leader, the individual was everything. Of course, all these phrases and epigrams are mere shorthand. In a sense, the individual is everything. It is the individual soul that is damned or saved, and the Church is only there to help a man to save it. But if in emphasizing this you are led to belittle the majesty of the Church, the divinity of its authority, and the enthusiastic acceptation of its organic character, you are doing a very ill service to the individual. If the Jesuits in Pascal's time had only represented this one tendency out of many, the quarrel would not have become as famous as it was. The Jesuits had also, by their discipline, their sacrifice of self, and their soldierly characteristics, acquired and retained great power, a power not only social but political. The reaction against the power within the Catholic Church is symbolized by the term Jansenism. Cornelius Jansen was a Dutch prelate born in the generation before Pascal, who had become Bishop of Ypres. He was the author of a big book, the brief title of which was the Augustinus. He drew from a one-sided reading of St. Augustine, as have many before and since, doctrines approaching and sometimes crossing the border line of heresy, especially in the matter of free will. From him came the whole body of opinion called in France Jansenism, the resemblance of which to Calvinism on account of this central tendency, which might also be called an affirmation against the freedom of the will and the corresponding insistence upon predestination, brought it into violent conflict with the Jesuits, whom the Jansenists accused of laxity. They said that the Jesuits, in their effort to reconquer Europe for Catholicism, had made things too easy for the world and its weaknesses. Especially did they attack those among the Jesuits had favored the more liberal and indulgent casuistical decisions. The word casuist has been very stupidly given a bad name by people who do not understand it. It simply means the application of morals to a particular case, and especially to a difficult case. For instance, the commandment of God forbids us to kill our fellow men, but there are cases in which, in spite of this commandment, we may kill our fellow men without sin. 99 people out of 100, indeed one might say almost all sane men, would answer yes, in self-defense, in a just war, as a wise punishment, and perhaps in certain other cases. It is worth noting, by the way, that the most sentimental people, who are loudest against the right to wage a just war or execute a criminal, are just the people who are most likely to be in favor of putting incurables out of their pain, which the commandment against murder most emphatically forbids. Anyhow, the laxer casuist writers among the Society of Jesus were made the special target of the Jansenist movement, when that movement had the good luck to secure the literary talent of Pascal on its side. Pascal launched out against the Jesuits and the more liberal, more humane casuists in a series of famous pamphlets known as the Provinciales. Their wit, their clarity, their gusto made them immediately famous, and of intense effect upon the educated world of their time. As style they are beyond praise. They launched modern French prose, and one may fairly say, modern prose as a whole. But if that be true of their literary or aesthetic side, it is most emphatically not true of their intellectual side. Pascal had not read the casuists whom he attacked. He often misunderstood what they had said. He was often plainly ignorant even of their most obvious meaning, because he had not read them, and he was downright wrong in the greater part of his conclusions. His attacks on Escobar make amusing reading, but it is false reading. He caricatures, and he caricatures in ignorance. Chateaubriand was quite right when he said that Pascal in the Provinciales had achieved an immortal lie. Pascal said he had read Escobar 3 times. He had plainly not read him once. It is strange that the literary and spiritual influence of Pascal should repose as it does upon a very small body of matter. Apart from the Provinciales, the only thing of his that really counts is a jumble of disjointed aphorisms which have had to be edited and re-edited to give them any cohesion, and which even so have no unity, and to which the title is generally given of the Pensies, or thoughts, of Pascal. Two of his ideas at least were profound and of high value, quite apart from the mere aesthetic value of his power of the word. One of these was the somewhat whimsical but arresting conception of the wager. It is not a rational conception, but it is calculated to make the skeptic think. It amounts virtually to this: if the Christian revelation be not true, I lose nothing by accepting it. If it be true, I gain everything by accepting it. As against this, I for my part will at once advance a certain sentence of St. Paul's, to the effect that if we are wrong in our choice of the Christian revelation, then we are of all men the most miserable. The other and more valuable, and what will, I think, prove the most permanent literary find of Pascal's, was his famous paradox on the coincident greatness and littleness of man. He did not invent that idea, of course. It is as old as human thought upon these things. Man is miserably weak, even physically. He is mortal, limited in all his powers, even those of the reason, subject to all matter of suffering and apparently unable to help himself, even where the path to a tolerable existence lies clear. But at the same time, man is gifted with a mind which can conceive the universe, and he is the child of God and in the image of God. All beauty is at his command. He can even, in a sense, create. He is vastly greater than anything else there is within our immediate experience, yet he is immeasurably less than what he knows he might be. He is at once despicable and awful, petty and supreme. That consideration on the contrasting and dual nature of man is perhaps the most fecund germ that can be planted in the soil of the mind, and Pascal planted it more surely and deeply than any other man in his brief statement. But Descartes will outlast Pascal. The peril to Catholicism proceeding from the rationalism of Descartes was apparently greater than the peril proceeding from the emotionalism of Pascal. The one was like a storm let loose against the old and firmly rooted oak. The other was like a sudden narrower flood, a torrent of water attacking its base. The tempest was the greater, and of the two forces, the more enduring in its results. Or one might put it in this way: the exaggeration of personal emotion in religion cannot produce a mood whereby a man who has left Catholicism will return to it. But an exaggeration of the function of reason is an error on the right side, and those who follow that path are more likely to promote the return of the world to the faith. For Pascal, the appreciation of any truth, especially a moral or religious truth, concerns the emotions. Faith in the mere formulae of doctrine would be a dead faith. In emotionalism, the action of the conscience is not that of a deductive rational process, or even that of an experiment or of an appreciation of an object from without. It is an internal imperative order, which does not base itself upon a thought-out process or a deliberately sought experience, but on the immediate sense. It is an emotion and nothing but an emotion of right and wrong. The natural reaction of a healthy mind against, say, the betrayal of a friend, does not work by presenting to the mind a process of thought, by detailing the consequences of the act or analyzing its character. The feeling is immediate and instinctive, and we know in some fashion that we are bound to obey. We know that if we do not obey, we are doing wrong, and no analysis will carry us beyond that. The thing is a postulate. One can see the consequences of such an overemphasis on emotions. However these things may be, these two great men stand for the reaction upon Catholicism as a whole produced by the upheaval of the 16th century and early 17th century, all that confused movement which has been called the Twin Warring Brothers, the Reformation and Renaissance. When we consider all the effect of them, the way in which Descartes has led to skeptical rationalism, Pascal to a contempt for doctrine, and a sort of cloud over the mind in which men lost the faith, the most remarkable thing still is that both men remained firmly of the faith, lived in it and died in it. They both were living proofs that the gates of hell had not prevailed, and that the Church had proved its power to survive. For my own part, two things that stand out most vividly in the case of either man are these. Of Descartes, that he had the humility, the faith, and the devotion to make the pilgrimage to Loreto. Of Pascal, the splendor of his death.